Welcome to this edition of Platform. I am Muhammad Kudu Abubakar. The activities of the insurgents in Nigeria, particularly in the northeast geopolitical zone of the country, appear to have stretched the resources and capacities of Nigeria's security forces over the years. Gladly, upon his assumption of office as president on May 29, 2015, President Muhammadu Buhari have lived up to his promise to fight insurgents. The Nigerian government's renewed impetus to fight has resulted in degrading the insurgent groups and had drastically reduced their capacity to perpetuate wanton destruction of lives and property. From May 25 to 26, 2016, the Nigerian Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution, in collaboration with the Council on African Security and Development and other partners, hosted a Nigeria Summit on national security in search for durable solutions to the challenges of insecurity in Nigeria. This edition of Platform examines these collaborative efforts by domestic and international bodies to support Nigeria's fight against insurgency and build a future of peace and prosperity in Nigeria. Our guest participated in the summit and presented a paper in one of its sessions titled "The Surge of Insurgency, Terrorism in Recent Times, Social and Economic Consequences." He is former United States Ambassador to Nigeria, Ambassador John Campbell, who served from 2004 to 2007. Ambassador Campbell was also political counselor in Nigeria from 1988 to 1990. He holds a Bachelor of Arts and Master of Arts degrees from the University of Virginia and a PhD in the 17th century English history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Between 2007 and 2008, Ambassador John Campbell was visiting professor of international relations at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Roman and Littlefield published his book, Nigeria Dancing on the Brink. The second edition was published in June 2013. Ambassador John Campbell is currently the Ralph Bonnke Senior Fellow for Africa Policy Studies at the Council for Foreign Relations in New York. He also writes the blog Africa in Transition and edits the Nigeria Security Tracker. Ambassador John Campbell, welcome to Platform.
Thank you very much. It's very good to be with you.
As usual, Platform has panelists. My immediate right here is Cosmos Ekpunobi, editor of the Authority newspaper.
Thank you very much.
My colleague, Omini Oden, is also on the panel. He is Assistant Manager News with the NTA International.
It's my pleasure being here.
Ambassador Campbell, once again, welcome to Platform here on NTA's network service. Before we examine your presentation at the Nigeria Summit on National Security, let's quickly get this. When you say the Nigeria Security Tracker, what do you mean?
What the Nigeria Security Tracker does is it tracks security incidents which are driven by political, social, economic conflict. The data is drawn entirely from open sources. What it enables you to do is to track the instance of violent episodes, but also the geographical distribution of violent episodes. So that if you want to see whether levels of violence in Borno State last week, how they compare with levels of violence in Borno State, say 6 months ago or a year ago.
I see. Is there any link between, when you say you get your information from public source?
Yes.
Does that include the media or some intelligence sources?
No, it's mostly the media. It's overwhelmingly the media because it's entirely open and unclassified sources. We have a person on staff who regularly, using various computer programs, combs through the media. Overwhelmingly the Nigerian media, but also the media in other countries.
How credible then are your sources?
The issue really is what the security tracker shows are trends. And I think as far as the trends are concerned, it's quite accurate. In terms of the numbers of deaths the absolute numbers. It's no more than an approximation, and almost certainly understates the number of deaths. But the trend lines, I think we can have a great deal of confidence in.
Are you obliged to give your information or data to the intelligence agencies then?
Well, the data is online. It's on the council's website. And in fact, an update of it appears in my blog every Monday. That means anybody who wants to, literally anybody, can look at it.
Now let's go to your paper. What really brought you to Nigeria and Abuja? It appears your deep knowledge of Nigeria manifested in that paper when you talked about the surge of insurgency and terrorism in recent times, social and economic consequences. What will you say, very briefly, is responsible to, if you like, the snowballing of insurgency in Nigeria?
The current round of the insurgency in Nigeria started in 2009 when a group based at the Railway Mosque in Maiduguri, under the leadership of Mohammed Yusuf, staged you can call it a demonstration or an insurrection, against the duly legitimate authorities. It was put down by the army and the police, and Mohammed Yusuf was killed pretty much in cold blood by the police in an episode that was captured by a video which went viral all over northern Nigeria. In the immediate aftermath, some 800 of his followers were also killed. Mosques were burned. And the remnant of his followers then went underground, led by a very shadowy figure by the name of Abubakar Shekau. In 2011, it reemerged with a series of jailbreaks to get its supporters out of jail. And also the first of the suicide bombings. There was a suicide attack on the Louis Edet police headquarters here in Abuja. There was also a suicide attack on the UN headquarters in Abuja. Thereafter, it expanded extremely rapidly. And by February of 2015, Boko Haram controlled territory as extensive as Belgium or the state of Maryland in the United States. The Nigerian flag was gone. The black flag of Boko Haram flew over government buildings. At that particular point, it looked as though the city of Maiduguri could fall to Boko Haram. During the period of Boko Haram expansion, in effect, there was a war between it and the security services, mostly the army, but also including the police, also including the Air Force. An outcome of that war, and also Boko Haram activities, was something like 2 million Nigerians were internally displaced. That is to say, they were driven from their homes. And several 100,000 Nigerians became refugees. That is to say, they fled outside of Nigeria. And those numbers they've somewhat declined, but not significantly. Now, 2 million internally displaced persons in Nigeria is a major humanitarian crisis. We can add to that the fact that since the re-emergence of Boko Haram, there has been little plowing and even less harvesting in northeastern Nigeria. That means food security has gone way down, and there is the threat of hunger and even famine. Anecdotal evidence, for example, that in some areas food prices have more than doubled.
Okay. Thank you. One of the very set of countries that Mr. President visited shortly after his inauguration was United States of America.
Yes.
And the issue of corruption and extreme terrorism were the front burner during the discussion with the American authority, and certain promises were made by Americans. In your own assessment, would you think that America has really done very well in terms of assisting Nigeria?
You said certain promises were made. I think that's an overstatement. There was a serious discussion between the Americans and the Nigerians, looking to reset in a much more positive way the bilateral relationship. And in those terms, the visit was a great success, as have subsequent visits that Mr. President has made to the United States. But it was not a situation in which there were a list of commitments made that you can sort of check off. It was rather the beginning of a serious dialogue. There was a particular focus, as you said, on corruption and also on terrorism. With respect to corruption, the various agencies of the United States government stepped up their cooperation with the Nigerian authorities to identify and ideally return funds that had been looted from Nigeria and were in the United States. That is an ongoing process. It's essentially a legal process, but it's an ongoing process that I think both sides would say has worked well. In terms of reestablishing a security relationship, that by its very nature is something that that takes longer to do. Essentially, the United States has to respond to specific requests from the Nigerian government. Those requests have been made, and my understanding is that the administration is considering them seriously. Here I must add, I have not been a part of the administration since 2007. I'm a private citizen, so I cannot speak for the Obama administration. All I can do is say what my understanding is from what I read and what I hear.
Yeah, but as an expert, what's your sense in the specific requests made by President Buhari to the United States, particularly in the areas of maybe purchase of weapons to fight Boko Haram and then the return of the loots?
As I say, with respect to funds that were stolen and ended up in the United States, that's an ongoing process that I think is working pretty well. What the American media says is that the administration is considering a request by the Nigerian government for the purchase of certain surveillance aircraft, small propeller planes, which can fly fairly low and presumably could be used for surveillance, but could also be used for fighting, because they can get pretty low. However, though there's plenty of speculation in the press, so far as I am aware, the administration has not forwarded that request to the Congress. Foreign military sales of that type have to be approved by the Senate. Notably, the New York Times last week did an editorial opposing such a sale. And Senator Leahy, who is the author of the so-called Leahy Amendment, his office has also signaled that it will oppose the sale. It remains to be seen.
What are their contentions? Both the Senator Leahy and New York Times, what are they saying?
The essential issue is that under the Leahy Amendment, and we call it an amendment, but it's actually American law, American military assistance is highly constrained if there have been credible accusations of human rights abuses, unless or until the host government takes practical and concrete steps to investigate those allegations and to take appropriate action. The issue from the perspective of the New York Times and from what the media says about Senator Leahy's staff, the issue is whether or not Nigeria has actually done that. In my remarks at the Nigerian Summit on National Security, I made the proposal that Nigeria might consider the establishment of a commission that essentially would function kind of like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, which in turn was based on Latin American precedents. The way that works is if individuals come forward, confess what they did, they are then granted amnesty. By the way, such a tool could be used in the case of accusations against security services, but at some point down the line, it could also be used with respect to members of Boko Haram.
Well, judging from the fact that a good number of the members of these insurgent groups are largely not Nigerians, they're either from Chad, Niger, Benin Republic, Cameroon. What happens to this group of persons
Well,
if the commission is domesticated or domiciled within Nigeria?
I guess I would make 2 points. First of all, I am not convinced that most of the insurgents are from outside of Nigeria. I think most of them are from Nigeria. Secondly, the crimes were committed within Nigeria, and therefore Nigeria would have jurisdiction.
But how practical is it for a military person to come out in the open and, if you like, confess, I did this and that? Even the Latin American example you gave, how practical was it?
Well,
how possible is it?
Military people did come forward in Latin America, and in South Africa, notably, police came forward. Because after all, if they don't come forward, then they are subject to prosecution under the law. And there are certain advantages for a perpetrator of abuses to come clean, get amnesty, as opposed to going before a judge and a jury.
Well, will 2 million internally displaced persons that you have mentioned, certainly the destabilizing effect on the civilian lives and social development is enormous. But you're quoting from your paper, if we can go back to your paper,
yeah.
How destabilizing has this been?
It's very, potentially at least, it's very stabilizing. We can start with the fact that a very small percentage of the internally displaced are actually in camps. In most cases, they have been taken in by what we Americans call kith and kin, friends, relatives, so forth. People who take in internally displaced persons have to feed them. How do they feed them? There's plenty of anecdotal evidence that they're being fed the seed corn for the next crop, because where else are you going to get food? Major problems with a large number of internally displaced being taken in by kith and kin, because it becomes much more difficult to provide them with relief. It's not a case when you have a huge population of internally displaced spread all over the place. You can't just send a food truck in and unload the food. You've got to somehow or another find out where the internally displaced are, where they're located, and then get the food to them. Let's take it one step further. A large number of internally displaced who almost certainly are not getting enough to eat, and who in the future may well face something approaching famine conditions. They become a possible incubator for all kinds of different diseases. Further, economic life in the far northeast has very largely ground to a halt. Very little economic activity going on in the far northeast. So essentially, you have almost a kind of chicken and an egg situation in which there are large numbers of internally displaced who cannot participate in the economy. The economy has collapsed, which means the large numbers of internally displaced can't get a living.
So, will you now then agree also to the suggestions at the summit by one of the respondents to a question where he said there is the need for profiling of the internally displaced persons so that some data, relevant or reliable data, can be gotten?
I agree with the essence of that. I would not have used the word profiling. I would have used the word census. In other words, find out who they are and where they are so that they can be relieved. But I would use the word census rather than profile. Profile to me implies taking a set of characteristics and imposing them on an individual. Here we want to find out who the individuals are and where they are.
Yeah. Some people blame terrorism in Africa on poverty and illiteracy. And unfortunately today, terrorism is getting more sophisticated. We see the way the people getting involved. Would you still believe in this theory?
I think those two can provide the context for terrorism, but they're not necessarily the causes of it. The question of why radical groups turn to violence, to me, is intensely interesting, because there are plenty of radical groups all over Africa that aren't violent. Just as there are plenty of parts of Africa or other parts of the world where a good portion of the population is alienated and marginalized. Okay, so why do they turn violent in one place but not in another? I agree with my fellow participant at the Nigeria Summit on National Security, Yaki Cilliers, that research shows what causes a tip into violence very often, most often, are abuses by the security services. That's what turns them to violence. And certainly that's what happened with Boko Haram. In other words, it was the overreaction by the security services in 2009 and the cold-blooded murder of Mohammed Yusuf, captured in a video, which then went viral, that I think is the sort of immediate background to the group launching a kind of terrorist trajectory. Now, something that's important, it's a kind of nuance, but still we need to bear it in mind. And that is, while the group at the railway mosque, by and large, were not violent, there were instances of them murdering individuals, particularly within the Muslim community, who opposed the form of Islam that was being preached. there was a murder that took place on my watch while I was still ambassador here, in which a highly respected imam, Imam Adam, was murdered just before the 2007 elections. And we all thought, or I thought, that the murder was related to the elections. It now seems pretty clear it was not, that it was rather Yusuf's followers moving against a Muslim cleric who was saying that in fact the Islam that Yusuf was preaching was illegitimate.
So what then will you say should be measures to contain or neutralize insurgency? Haven't now been able to analyze or tell us the root causes?
I think there are two things. First of all, it takes a long time. It takes a long time, and it has to be done step by step. There's no magic solution to it. But doing things like broadening the areas where people feel secure, that's the first point. The second point is then trying to address their immediate needs. That means food. Then moving on to the provision of educational and medical services. And then there is the bringing of them back into a political process. Terribly difficult, takes a long time. What do we see in parts of the Northeast now? What we see in parts of the Northeast now is that the military has cleared Boko Haram out of a particular territory. People try to go back. Boko Haram then reappears, and so they flee again. Now, Boko Haram reappears. It can't hold the territory, but it can provide a level of terror that leads people to leave again. So it's hard. I don't want to oversimplify the challenges that the Nigerian government faces.
We may not get to meet with you after the summit held in Nigeria. It's coming back to back after the second regional summit held in Abuja. And one of the concerns of the summit you addressed is the way forward. Are you likely to look forward to mainstream it with what the second regional summit arrived at?
Well, let me tell you what I advocate for. What I advocate for as a private citizen in Washington is much more international planning for humanitarian relief, closer cooperation and coordination with the Nigerian government, because of course the international community can provide humanitarian relief only at the invitation and in cooperation with the Nigerian government. There is a lot of hard thinking going on about how to do this best in Washington, but also particularly in New York at the UN and amongst the various humanitarian agencies.
Well, in your paper, you did mention some countries that you think Nigeria should approach.
Yes.
Malaysia, Saudi Arabia,
Yes.
and Indonesia. Why?
Yes. Well, it depends for what. In the case of Saudi Arabia has a domestic program for the de-radicalization of terrorists, elements of which have been incorporated in Nigeria's own program for de-radicalization, a program which I understand actually has had good results. The trouble is it's too small. It needs to be greatly expanded. Okay, a program like that, to expand it, it's going to be costly. Everybody knows that Nigeria's revenue is down because oil prices are down. It would seem to me to be appropriate to go to Saudi Arabia and to the Gulf states to ask for assistance in expanding the program. So that's why I would approach Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. In the case of Malaysia and Indonesia, they have been extremely forward-thinking on questions of educational and medical reform within an Islamic context. So it's a place to go for ideas, certainly, but also I would not be too proud to ask them for financial support in both of those areas. It's interesting. You may recall, I was ambassador here when there was considerable opposition to polio vaccination in northern Nigeria. That opposition was overcome in large measure by procuring the vaccine from Malaysia, in other words, from a Muslim country.
Let me go off the summit briefly. Given some of the policy stance the present administration has taken, it looks as though the EU seems not to be in favor of it. The EU feels Nigeria is locked in, Nigeria should liberalize, Nigeria should open up. But Nigeria feels that's not the best way to go. What's your position?
Now, when you say locked up...
That Nigeria should open up its borders, compete favorably, not to lock up, allow the Naira to be devalued. What's your own position?
Oh, on the Naira?
Yeah. Economic policy generally.
Economic policy
yes.
Generally. I'm no economist.
Forex policy,
right.
Forex and what have you.
Yeah, right. I'm no economist, so I have no particular expertise to bring to that matter.
Okay.
But there's a second issue, and that is these are preeminently Nigerian domestic issues. In other words, economic policy is the policy of the president and the administration that is in office. I was here before. First time I was here, there was under General Babangida. It was a system where there was essentially a two-tier exchange rate. There was the so-called official exchange rate, and then there was the unofficial exchange rate, and the gulf between the two was huge. What it did was it facilitated corruption. And when, in fact, the gulf between the two exchange rates was reduced through government policy, the economy improved. So, based on that experience, I tend to think that a realistic exchange rate is probably best. But I'm no expert. And again, this is very much a matter for the Nigerian administration in office.
Well, as someone who largely depends on the media, by your own admission,
yes,
to publish the Nigeria Security Tracker,
yes,
your thoughts on the role of the media and civilians in counter-terrorism efforts,
yes,
I think will be germane here.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Well, with respect to the media, the first is the media must have access. In the case of the Northeast, I think the Nigerian media, but also the international media, should have been given unfettered access. And of course, they did not have that. This is important because it is incumbent on the media to be absolutely as accurate as it can be. How can it be accurate if it's not there? And if it's dependent on wire service reports or official statements from the military? So, absolutely necessary that it have access, absolutely necessary that it be accurate. And with respect to statements from the security services, which are often the only thing the media has, they too should put a premium on accuracy and not make exaggerated claims that in fact dissolve in thin air when looked at very closely. There's a problem with exaggerated claims made by official spokesmen. The problem is, once they lose credibility, it's very hard to get it back. So that, if in fact Amnesty International says X, and a security service spokesman says Y, In the United States, and I suspect more generally outside of Nigeria, amnesty has more credibility.
Why?
Because amnesty is very careful to document every single assertion it makes. And whenever it has to use estimates, which it tries to avoid, it always takes the lowest one, not the highest.
But at times people feel that they are biased. Anyway, that takes me to the next question. In a couple of days, the present administration in Nigeria will be 1 full year in office.
Yes.
What's your assessment?
My assessment's pretty positive. Look what he's done. A meaningful campaign against corruption. Far more meaningful than any previous campaign against corruption. I mean, the public investigation of very, very high persons. This is something new, and this is something that has the potential for changing the culture for the good. I know, yes, there is corruption involving millions and millions of naira. There is also corruption involving a policeman at a checkpoint, essentially shaking down everybody who passes through. But the point is, if you start to address corruption at the top, eventually that kind of trickles down. And you then end up with people who say, no, Mr. Policeman, I will not pay to get through your checkpoint. It takes a while, it takes years, in fact, to bring about that kind of transformation. But the point is, that journey has started. And that, I think, is extraordinarily positive. Second, in my view, the achievements by the security services against Boko Haram are real. Boko Haram is not destroyed, and I think it's a mistake to think that it is. But Boko Haram has been driven out of significant amounts of territory. Significant numbers of kidnapped victims have been freed. Not all of them, but significant numbers. That's important. How did he do that? He did that using Nigerian resources. He also did it through active diplomatic activity involving Niger, Cameroon, Chad, and Benin. So on the security front, again, the journey's not over, but the journey has had a good start. Third, very careful appointments. Seems to me that you can make an argument that the persons he has appointed to office are of high quality. What that's going to mean over time is the quality of administration is going to get better. It seems to me that his basic philosophy is you appoint very good people to office and then you hold them accountable. Well, that's a formula for improving the deliverance of government services. You improve the delivery of government services, that enhances popular confidence in the government.
Having said that, what support do you think the organizations you represent, for example, the Council on Foreign Relations and others, what support do you think they can give Nigeria and give President Buhari to continue to do more?
Well, now, the first point about the Council is the Council is absolutely nonpartisan. The Council takes absolutely no position on anything. What the Council does is it provides, among other things, is it provides a platform for people like me. But it itself does not take formal positions. Now, arguably, and this may already be underway, I don't really know, the relationship between the Council and Nigerian organizations such as NIIA, the Nigerian Institute for International Affairs, that presumably could be strengthened. we have to make a distinction between think tanks, organizations like the Council, and particularly American philanthropic organizations. I'm thinking, for example, of the MacArthur Foundation, which over the years has provided substantial support for the Nigerian university system. They operate entirely independently of the American government, but they pay very close attention to what is going on in the host country. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of the successful elections in 2015 in terms of the understanding of Nigeria. The fact that an opposition political figure was elected president for the first time in Nigeria's history in elections that were widely regarded as credible and with relatively low levels of violence, that is a very dramatic and important development.
But such a think tank like yours should have some influence on policies by the American government.
Well,
for example, the Senator Leahy amendment.
Not the Council. Individuals in the Council can, but not the Council as an organization. In other words, somebody up on the Hill might pay attention to John Campbell, who's the Ralph Bunche Fellow for African Policy at the Council. But that's different from the Council, if that distinction makes any sense.
Okay, your book. I've not read it, but do you still believe in what you talked about Nigeria? Nigeria dancing on the brink.
Yeah.
And you have done a second edition already?
Yeah, it came out in 2013,
Yep.
Before, of course, the elections of
Are you
2015.
behind or ahead of it in terms of what you said and what is playing out now?
Well, at the time the book was written, Nigeria had not had a highly successful election. Now it has. That changes a lot. In other words,
So your predictions were not right.
no. First of all, I didn't make any predictions. It's widely said that I predicted that Nigeria would break up in 2015. I never, ever said that because I never believed
You only
that.
alluded to that.
Not even that. What I said was that if under certain circumstances things were to occur in a certain way, then there was a possibility for widespread unrest, and it would be hard to predict exactly what the consequences of it would be. But the notion that somehow I predicted that Nigeria would break up in 2015, I find quite ludicrous, because I have always thought that the forces that hold Nigeria together were strong enough to prevent fragmentation. What could happen in the future is that the center could become weaker and weaker, and power could devolve to regions. In other words, it's what 15 years ago was described as the road to Kinshasa. That in other words, Nigeria could end up looking something like Congo. But that's very far away from the notion of Nigeria breaking up.
Well, what you're saying now, is it anything similar to what even some proponents within the country are talking about, true federalism, for example?
Well, for example,
whereby a lot of powers that now reside with the federal government will be devolved to the 36 states?
yeah, the difference between that and the road to Kinshasa is that that would be regulated by a constitution and the law. What happens in Congo is that it's basically local warlords.
Okay, the second edition of the book that he mentioned, Nigeria Dancing on the Brink, came in 2013.
That's right.
We've had, in your own words, a successful election in
That's right.
2015. So the third edition
Yeah.
Exactly.
When do we
Should
expect
go the
that?
way.
And then
Well-
what color will it take?
won't be a third edition. With a colleague, I am working on a book for Oxford University Press called Everything You Need to Know About Nigeria. And that book, we would hope, will be out in the coming year.
Well, the EU-Nigeria partnership is 40 years, and the EU came up with so many things they have done over time: community development, healthcare, cultural, institutional strengthening, and what have you. What's your assessment?
First of all, I don't know very much about the partnership between Nigeria and the EU, because my focus has been on the partnership between Nigeria and the United States.
Okay.
However, in general, my sense has been that EU partnerships in Africa have been helpful, have been positive, but I have no details.
What? Oh, go ahead.
How would you assess Nigerian Parliament today, vis-a-vis in terms of openness, in terms of helping government in the fight against corruption? From what you used to know about Nigerian Parliament?
If I could wave a magic wand, I would greatly increase the resources available to Nigerian parliamentarians. Something like what we have for our members of Congress, a Congressional Research Service, whereby members of Congress can go and essentially get studies on almost anything, get answers to questions of fact. First point. Second point, I would increase the staffs of members of Parliament, of members of the National Assembly, because my sense is that many of them have to do everything. They have to answer the mail, they have to answer the telephone, they have to do everything. They don't have the kind of support they need if they are to play the role in governance that the Constitution ascribes to it.
Then if that's the case, what will you say now of the perception within Nigeria and even without, that Nigerian parliamentarians appear to be the highest paid parliamentarians in the world?
Indeed, and that undermines their credibility. Two things here. First of all, there's a real lack of transparency here. It's very unclear how much Nigerian parliamentarians are actually paid, because you have a system of essentially salaries plus allowances, many of which are hard to dollarize. So that, for example, there are estimates that a member of the Nigerian National Assembly will make more than $1 million US a year. Well, maybe. And if, in fact, it is really that high, then the system of compensation cries out for reform.
Now, let's go to your writings on your blog, where you say Africa in transition. To what extent will you say Africa is in transition, or in 2016?
Well, look at where we are. Transition, that means movement. Take commodities. Africa's economy, or the economy of many African states, is overly dependent on commodities. In Nigeria's case, oil and natural gas. Okay. Prices plunge, the economy declines. Transition, movement. Take politics. Highly successful elections in 2015, a vigorous anti-corruption program, potential for transforming the political culture of the country, transition, movement in a positive direction. It's going to vary from country to country. I have a book coming out either this week or next week on South Africa called Morning in South Africa, M-O-R-N-I-N-G. It's an optimistic book. It argues that despite the really quite dreadful government that South Africa has now under President Jacob Zuma, despite that, South Africa's institutions, its democratic and liberal institutions, are strong enough to carry the country over a patch of bad government. Just as American institutions have been strong enough to carry us over a patch of bad government in the past, and possibly in the future.
Will you say that of Nigeria in conclusion, as we round off?
That the institutions are strong enough? The institutions in Nigeria are still in the process of development. And Nigerians and the friends of Nigeria should do all that they can to encourage the development of those institutions.
Ambassador John Campbell, former U.S. Ambassador to Nigeria, thank you so very much for your thoughts on several issues, particularly issues of national security and insurgency. And it's a pleasure that you indeed came to our studio.
It's a pleasure being with you, and thank you so very much.
Cosmos Ekponobi, editor, Authority newspaper, thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
Omini Edem, or Dem, assistant manager news, NT International.
It's also been my pleasure being here.
Yeah, thank you. That's all. Platform had engaged the former United States Ambassador to Nigeria, Ambassador John Campbell, on his thoughts on the surge of insurgency and terrorism in recent times in Nigeria. He analyzed and preferred solutions to Nigeria's challenges of insecurity, including how domestic and international organizations can be galvanized to support Nigeria's rebuilding and rehabilitation of destroyed territories and peoples. That's Platform. I am Muhammad Kuda Abubakar. Bye for now.